In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Although America now has a completely voluntary military, in regard to past conflicts, we are living in a time of relative peace. There have been several instances where the American military has turned to a draft.
Today, the young man of America must face up to this fact. When he is 18, he can be drafted.
The draft is a system for selecting young men for compulsory military service. This applied to all men over the age of 18 and was done to help gain numbers for the military during war.
It was understood that that force would be of a limited size and capability, maybe to handle two small wars in two different parts of the world. But if we ever got to the point where something more was needed, then you bring up the Guard and the reserves, and if you needed even more than that, then the nation would have to face the possibility of going back to a draft.
The nation's first military draft began in 1940 when President Roosevelt signed the Selective Training and Service Act.
Now, therefore, I, Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States of America, under and by virtue of the authority vested in me, do proclaim the following. First, the first registration under the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 shall take place on Wednesday, the 16th day of October, 1940.
This put immeasurable responsibilities on the shoulders of boys just 18 years of age. These boys were forced to leave their families and put their lives on the line for their country. They endured experiences that many of us can never even begin to fathom. The young men that did not end up dead because of these lived with nightmares and horrid memories for the rest of their lives. Their youth was displayed on Christmas Day during World War I when conflicting forces threw down their weapons and called an unofficial truce. Gifts were exchanged between the sides and games were played. This exemplified how these soldiers were still young at heart and how they were not fighting because of personal vendettas, but rather just because they were following orders.
This became known as the Christmas Truce of 1914. Many individuals went to great lengths to avoid being drafted. There were riots, some burned their draft cards, others fled the country. Sometimes men who had physical problems, were attending college, or were needed at home to support their families might be granted deferments. A lot of the draft-aged men that received deferments were from wealthy and educated families. There were many celebrities that avoided the draft that the public began to know as draft dodgers, and they each had their own reasoning and way to get out of it. One of those being Muhammad Ali, who avoided being drafted for religious reasons.
There have been many questions put to me why I refuse to be inducted into the United States Army. The number one greeting in my faith is peace, and that is Assalamu alaikum, which means may peace be unto you. Even if the wealth of America was given to me for taking the step, the wealth of America and the friendship of all of the people who support the war, this will still be nothing if I am not content internally and if I'm not in accord with the will of Almighty Allah.
Other big-name people that dodged the draft were Dick Cheney, Grover Cleveland, Jimi Hendrix, Rush Limbaugh, and Ted Nugent.
For generations, America has waged war with a draft.
Whether we're talking the Civil War, whether we're talking Vietnam, whether we're talking World War I, World War II, when we needed a big army, the president turned to the draft.
The draft played part mostly in World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War. Young men that could not even legally drink a beer were forced to put their lives on the line in violent battle. The sights and sounds of the battlefield are something that the soldiers who managed to survive would never forget. This made assimilation back into society very difficult, if not impossible.
Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a condition that develops after a person has had a terrifying experience which usually involves the threat of harm or death, either to oneself or to another person or persons. This can happen from things in everyday life, such as torture, rape, car accidents, or physical abuse, but it is most commonly found in war veterans. In military settings, PTSD is used to refer to war veterans suffering after the extreme confrontations of their combat experiences. PTSD can start to happen the minute you get home from war, or it could begin 20 years after you have done your deployment. These memories just stick in your brain, and whether it is now or sometime in the future, they will come back to haunt you.
The things that these veterans have seen on the battlefield, from women and children getting shot, their best friend being killed right next to them, their own vehicle being blown up and them being the only survivor. These are such dreadful memories, but these men and women suffering from this syndrome are having to relive these moments in their everyday life. The slightest things can trigger a PTSD attack.
Everything is dangerous, helplessness, hopelessness, had a lot of nightmares. Everything in your world becomes a potential threat. You're paying attention to everything. You can scan. Everything is triggering something inside of you. A smell can send you right back to the last dead body you saw.
New research shows more than 270,000 Vietnam veterans are currently still experiencing significant symptoms of PTSD 40 years after the war ended.
For Vietnam veterans, I would say is that, they really did not have services for PTSD available to them when they came home.
Symptoms include flashbacks, nightmares, and severe anxiety, as well as uncontrollable thoughts about the event. These symptoms can lead to drug and alcohol use, paranoia, anger, sleep problems, the inability to maintain stable relationships, and difficulty feeling emotions. At least 30% of veterans who participated in the Vietnam War experienced some form of PTSD at some point after returning home from war. This is still an issue today, as 1 in 4 veterans of Iraq or Afghanistan have been diagnosed with PTSD, and war veterans make up 20% of suicides in the United States today. Living with PTSD is something that a lot of young Americans were forced to experience due to being drafted into the military. These kids didn't want to go overseas and have their lives put at risk. They had goals and aspirations. They used to, at least before they were required to join the military. And a lot of them never were and never will be able to achieve these goals due to the negative effects of being sent to war when they were just kids.